Archaeology is a glimpse into the past. It's a window so that we can find out what happened back then.
Here we have the largest force ever assembled in North America, 15,000 men. This armada stretched for about 6 miles on Lake George, virtually covering the entire surface of the lake.
I often thought about the actual character of the men that manned these vessels. What they did required almost superhuman strength.
The movement of goods, the movement of people was all done on the water. It was all waterborne in the early days. So that's where our beginnings are. That's where our histories began in this country.
Shipwrecks become time capsules of our historic experience. The environmental process may degrade them, but those are artifacts that are left as they were at the time they sank.
The historical record mentions that hundreds of these vessels were sunk in Lake George, but they never did say exactly how it was accomplished. So what we see today, instead of an entire boat, is basically the flat bottom boards, the cleats, and small nubs of the remaining frames.
When we talk about preserving and protecting the lake, it's important for us to recognize that it's not only the water quality that is necessary to protect, but it's also the historical significance of the area, because the two go hand in hand.
There is a graveyard at the bottom of Lake George, a collection of sunken juggernauts that 2.5 centuries ago moved the armies of a mighty European empire. Shrouded by dark blue waters, these skeletons are the remains of a submerged colonial wharf and the remnants from over 260 British warships, the latter sunk to hide them from their enemy, the French and their Native American allies. These cultural treasures now rest in peace as shipwreck sleuths known as maritime archaeologists investigate this subsurface battlefield. Underwater detectives want answers to puzzling questions. Why did the British sink their flotilla? How did they plan to raise their squadron? And how did the intentional sinking of this fleet help the British win the French and Indian War? Today, these wooden bones provide archaeologists with a rare opportunity to study one of the historical mysteries of 18th century America.
Archaeology is a study of the past by an examination of the material culture, that is, the physical evidence that's left by humankind. The job of the archaeologist is to test the historical record and to fill in what history does not tell us.
In many respects, archaeologists must treat a cultural site like a crime scene, the archaeological equivalent of identifying the murder weapon, noting the position of the victim, finding fingerprints, and searching for clothing fibers and hair samples. While most archaeological discoveries have been made on land, the new frontier for archaeology lies underwater.
Shipwrecks become time capsules of our historic experience. The environmental process may degrade them, but those are artifacts that are left as they were at the time they sank. We can learn a lot about technology, we can learn a lot about lifeways if these sites remain undisturbed and if we treat them responsibly.
In September 1987, two diving historians, Dr. Russell P. Bellico and Joseph W. Zarzinski, set up a training course for scuba divers at Lake George, instructed by marine archaeologist Duncan Mathewson.
That workshop became the genesis for Bateaux Below. For 3 days, divers came and were taught the principles of underwater archaeology. Out of that came the group Bateaux Below that began studying the sunken fleet of 1758.
Much like crime scene investigators, these scuba-clad scientists are in search of wooden bones. Military conflicts are generally won or lost based upon battlefield strategies: attack, defend, lay siege, counterattack, and even retreat to fight another day. Such was the case with the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. This conflict began in North America over competing land claims in the Ohio River Valley.
The French and Indian War was actually a long process of several wars. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. And so the French and Indian War, which 1755 to 1763, was the last of many wars between the two empires in North America, the French and New France or Canada, and parts of the United States today, and of course the English colonies.
Hostilities at Lake George began on September 8, 1755, in warfare known as the Battle of Lake George. British forces won that contest against the French and their Native American allies. Before the end of the year, the British built a fortress at the southern end of Lake George, known as Fort William Henry. In August 1757, the French captured Fort William Henry and destroyed it. The following year, 1758, was a pivotal time during the French and Indian War.
The British goal during 1758 was a campaign to rid the French from the Champlain Valley. So the campaign of 1758 was first to capture Fort Carillon and proceed north on Lake Champlain and capture Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point.
By July 1758, the British had assembled a large army at the south end of Lake George.
Here we had the largest force ever assembled in North America, 15,000 men. 9,000 provincial troops, these are colonial troops from New England and New York and New Jersey, and approximately 6,300 British regulars.
The British Army was carried in 900 bateaux, 135 whaleboats, a large sloop, and several floating gun batteries.
This armada stretched for about 6 miles on Lake George, virtually covering the entire surface of the lake.
Unexpectedly, the British were defeated at Fort Carillon, later known as Fort Ticonderoga. The British troops retreated to the south end of Lake George, where they built more vessels for a second invasion into the Champlain Valley. They also erected a wharf to receive their warships. With winter approaching, without Fort William Henry to protect the fleet, and because in March 1757 the French destroyed over 300 British warships pulled up onto shore, the British made a daring decision. They decided to sink their squadron, intending to recover as many warships as possible the following year. When the British returned in 1759, they raised the sloop Earl of Halifax and other sunken boats. Many, though, were not recovered. A century ago, one of Lake George's colonial shipwrecks met with an unceremonious ending.
In 1903, a vessel was raised. It was very near the steamboat dock, which is actually near one of the colonial docks. This was probably the Earl of Loudon. This was burned in the March 1757 raid on Fort William Henry. And when they raised it, it had all kinds of artifacts that date to that period, a 1743 coin, military buttons, cannonballs. So it definitely was a war vessel.
Following that salvage, the colonial sloop was cut up for souvenirs. In the early 1990s, the Lake George Historical Association Museum received a donation of several hull timbers from that warship. Because the timbers were not properly conserved when the hulk was raised, it is unlikely these hull frames will have great longevity. The underwater exploration of Lake George began as early as the 1930s, when a group developed and used a crude breathing apparatus, a homemade diving helmet. In the early 1950s, a local scuba diver, Carl Dunn, explored the shallows searching for colonial artifacts for local businessmen who had erected a replica of Fort William Henry to attract tourists. It was not until the 1960s, however, that the modern era of underwater archaeology began at Lake George. In July 1960, two teenage sport divers, Fred Bolt and Robert Lavoie, found several sunken bateaux.
So it was the general excitement of the time, the period where people were excited about scuba diving. They called divers frogmen.
Later that summer, two Saratoga Springs, New York scuba divers, Walter Stroop and Fred Tarrant, located a bateau-like vessel. Aboard was a cache of mortar bombs, each weighing approximately 160 pounds. Over the years, many mortar bombs were raised and ended up in various museums. That same year, 1960, with a permit from the state of New York, the Adirondack Museum recovered several bateaux from the lake. One was exhibited for years at that museum in Blue Mountain Lake, New York. Today, those 1960 salvaged bateaux are in storage at a New York State Museum facility near Albany. The colonial bateau was the utilitarian vessel of its time. It was possibly Dutch in origin and was later adopted by the French and English.
The bateau was a workhorse of these armies. Generally, they would hold between 20 to 22 men. They would carry 10 to 12 barrels of provisions. It was the backbone of any army because the only way to travel was by water. There were no roads in this period of time. This is a wilderness.
Historically, bateaux are built of white pine planks, which were abundant in the woods in the North Country. And the framing members, we believe, were built primarily out of oak. Oak knees were used for the frames. Oak knees were used for the bow and stern post to give the boat greater strength. And the white pine planks were cut probably to a thickness of less than an inch, and either butt jointed together or scarfed together to create the 28 or 36-foot lengths that were needed for the bottoms and sides of these boats. The boats had flat bottoms. Boards in the bottom were connected by battens, which tied them together. The frames were erected on top of the bottom boards, and then the side planking was stretched across those frames. It's very simple from a construction point of view. Turns out to be a very forgiving kind of boat to build.
The bateau did not have a rudder. Instead, an oar was tied to the stern for steerage. Bateaux were generally rowed, but sometimes they were poled, and even a crude mast and sail could be employed. From 1963 to 1964, Richfield Springs, New York diver Terry Crandall conducted an underwater survey for the Adirondack Museum. Called Operation Bateau, its primary objective was to search for vessels of the sunken fleet.
What I would look for would be the evidence of additional ribs sticking up through the mud on the bottom. They have a tendency to look like a limb out of a tree sticking straight up through the mud. And then when I'd feel down along that rib, if I could feel additional planking, then I knew I was over a site. And in many cases, I would photograph it and or draw pictures on the bottom.
Decades before the use of Global Positioning System, or GPS, Crandall accurately mapped the locations of several dozen bateaux using a 9-digit mapping system overlaid onto lake charts. In 1965, the New York State Police made scuba dives at bateau sites in the lake. This was done more as a training operation than a scientific study. 2 decades later, in 1987, there began a renewed interest in Lake George's bateau shipwrecks. From 1987 to 1991, the volunteer group that became known as Bateaux Below conducted a non-intrusive archaeological study at one cluster of shipwrecks known as the Weowaka Bateaux. Using tape measures, pencils, slates, and underwater cameras, divers mapped the site. Their fieldwork revealed that 7 bateaux remained in the shipwreck cluster. The dive team designated them as Bateaux A through G. 6 of the 7 bateaux were oriented perpendicular to shore for ease of recovery.
The Weowaka site was one that I returned to a number of different times. Those vessels had quite a bit of remaining rib structure to them. One was lying in a completely different profile, parallel to the shoreline rather than obliquely.
During dives conducted in 1988, the archaeological team discovered that vandals had ripped apart Bateaux B, destroying its structural integrity. Bateaux Below's 4-year investigation of the Weowaka Bateaux was in reality an archaeological jigsaw puzzle. The fieldwork, conducted by Crandall and later by Bateaux Below, uncovered evidence of interchangeable parts on colonial bateaux. The 18th century carpenters who built these watercraft devised an assembly line to mass-produce the vessels in bateau factories located in Schenectady, Albany, and elsewhere. The bateau men also used replaceable wooden thole pins and pads, the equivalent of the modern-day oarlock. When the thole pins and pads wore out, extras carried on board were used.
Generally speaking, there's a big difference between the ship versus the shipwreck. You have wreck formation processes that take place going from a ship to a shipwreck. And that's what we see at Lake George with many of these vessels. We're not seeing, except for the land tortoise, we're not seeing at Lake George complete ships underwater. So it takes a trained eye to look at a site and then to make accurate archaeological inferences based upon the archaeological record.
More than likely, what happened when these vessels were put down, the iron fasteners that held the hull planks on were probably the first to go. After they had rotted out, the hull planks probably fell off one by one. So what we see today, instead of an entire boat, is basically the flat bottom boards, the cleats, and small nubs of the remaining frames that were mostly protected by the silt that acquired over them throughout the years.
The fieldwork, conducted by Terry Crandall and Bateaux Below, though 25 years apart, uncovered much about the Weowaka Bateaux.
The historical record mentions that hundreds of these vessels were sunk in Lake George, but they never did say exactly how it was accomplished. Bateaux Below divers did discover that these vessels contained hundreds of pounds of rocks, and they also found holes that had been bored into the bottoms. So this is evidence of intentional sinking of these vessels.
This deliberate sinking of 260 bateaux was a strategy to place the watercraft in cold storage, with plans to return the following year to raise and reuse the fleet.
What I did find on a couple of occasions were other objects that belied the fact that the British did indeed intend to refloat the vessels that were sunken. I found a section of a log which had been pointed to some degree, and then a hole drilled through it. And it was sunk right along with the bateau site itself, as if it were afloat, where the rope had wasted away, but then it too became waterlogged and sunk to the bottom. More than one of these would have marked the particular spot where a cluster of bateaux were resting on the bottom.
So then, why weren't the Weowaka Bateaux and other submerged warships recovered from Lake George in 1759?
The historical record doesn't have a lot of information about how easy it was or how difficult it was to raise these vessels in 1759. However, looking at the condition of these vessels, most of them 30 to 35 feet long, and all of them having hundreds of pounds of rocks on top of them to help sink them, it probably was very difficult for the British to raise most of their fleet. That's why we have several dozen bateaux that are sunk in the lake.
The research team also discovered another reason why Lake George is a graveyard of colonial bateaux.
2 decades of studying the sunken fleet of 1758 has revealed that many of these vessels could not be raised because in the process of trying to retrieve those, the stem, that is the bow post, was pulled loose, and thus these vessels are not pulled up on shore.
Though souvenir-seeking scuba divers had inflicted some damage to the sunken bateau, this is the best collection of French and Indian War shipwrecks found in North America. Thus, these sunken vessels provide insight into 18th century military life.
I often thought about the actual character of the men that manned these vessels and had a certain degree of admiration for them. What they did required almost superhuman strength to lift massive rocks and place them in the vessels to sink them, to somehow retrieve them using primitive ways of, like perhaps oxen on the shore or just a group of men pulling ropes and attaching them to the bateau to recover it in the springtime.
Today, the 7 sunken battlecraft lying offshore near the Weowaka Holiday House are part of a unique state park for scuba divers, commonly referred to as shipwreck preserves.
Shipwreck preserves are actually shipwreck parks for divers. Here you have controlled public access for the diving community. The dive boat pulls up, attaches the bow line to a buoy, and then the divers go down a line. Then when they're on the bottom, there's informational signage there and guidelines to take them around so that divers can have not only recreation, but they can come away learning a little bit about the history of the lake.
Known as submerged heritage preserves, this underwater park was created in 1993. One site in the shipwreck park is the sunken fleet of 1758 preserve, previously known as the Weowaka Bateau. In 1992, prior to opening the shipwreck preserve, the 7 shipwrecks were listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
The 7 bateaux that we nominated that are now part of the Weowaka Bateau site are 7 very intact examples. They're important in documenting the construction practices and the design of these boats that were a very important part of these campaigns in North America.
In 2006, a shipwreck preserve network called the New York State Underwater Blueway Trail was established.
Several objectives to the development of a statewide underwater blueway trail. The 2 primary objectives are identify and protect historic and other cultural underwater resources, and second, to provide a means for the public to get to know of or understand what those resources are. The movement of goods, the movement of people was all done on the water. It was all waterborne in the early days. So that's where our beginnings are, that's where our histories began in this country, and we want to promote that and inform the public of it.
Using the Lake George shipwreck preserves as a possible model, the Underwater Blueway Trail is creating a network of shipwreck preserves around the Empire State.
The village of Lake George, together with 5 other municipalities, decided they would apply to the state for an Environmental Protection Fund grant that provides funds to municipalities to develop innovative programs to protect, preserve, or manage coastal and inland waterway resources. In this instance, those 6 municipalities decided that they would apply for a grant to identify, develop, and promote their underwater cultural resources, and to use the means by which they developed these sites and promoted them as recreational and historic dive sites.
The Underwater Blueway Trail hopes to promote recreational and heritage tourism, as well as foster preservation of the state's historic shipwrecks. An integral aspect of the initiative will be the innovative interpretation of the shipwrecks, utilizing brochures, underwater and shoreside signage, museum and visitor center exhibits, websites, interactive computer technology, podcasts, and documentary productions. One of the more intriguing methods that taught local students about 18th century life at Lake George was an endeavor directed by Ted Caldwell, a Bolton Landing, New York school administrator. Caldwell incorporated replica archaeology into an educational project at area public schools.
About 12 years ago, I wrote a grant to the Lake Champlain Basin program requesting funding for a boat building project which would involve students. And the idea was to involve students from Bolton, Minerva, and Newcomb. We started the project by going to the Adirondack Museum and working with their boating curator, Hallie Bond. And we saw the original bateau from Lake George. And so the kids were able to get good ideas about how a bateau, what it looks like, how it's used. And then we began to modify designs so that we could build a bateau that was workable and that would involve as many students as possible. In the end, we ended up, through that grant, building 3 bateaux. It was a great project. And we've been using the bateau ever since.
Caldwell's classes built several bateaux that proved to be valuable lessons to the students.
In actually launching and rowing these things, they realized that they were tippy, they leaked, they didn't necessarily work well in rough water. They learned a lot of the things in miniature that all the soldiers went through, 200 years ago.
In 1997, Bateaux Below received one of Caldwell's replica bateaux. After getting permission from the state of New York, the archaeology team sank a 23-foot-long replica at the Sunken Fleet of 1758 Shipwreck Preserve. This not only tested how the colonials sank their bateaux with a goal to retrieve them, the project also accomplished 2 other objectives. The replica provides visiting divers with an opportunity to view an intact replica bateau in an underwater environment. It also allows for the long-term study of how wooden vessels deteriorate and wreck in fresh water. During the 2007-2008 school year, technology class teachers and students at Maple Avenue Middle School in Saratoga Springs, New York, worked with Bateaux Below, the Village of Lake George, the New York State Office of General Services, and other state agencies to build a full-size replica of a 1758 bateau shipwreck.
The project is a reconstruction of the bateaux that were once used by the British Army during the French and Indian War. So what we're doing is making a replica of the boat as it has decayed.
The process that the students go through is first come up with a drawing. Everything needs to have a plan, and then we actually laid out a full-size pattern on the floor.
Then we actually have to get into acquiring the materials, processing the materials in a craft-style type of production. So it's a lot of hand work for the students to actually get this boat to look very similar to what it should look like now underneath the water.
The 30-foot-long replica bateau wreck was placed into the lake in June 2008. It lies in shallow water next to a popular pedestrian walkway and informs visitors about what a 250-year-old military bateau shipwreck would look like today.
Its significance in the early history of the United States is really all but forgotten. And to resurrect that particular vessel would be of vast importance because it was indeed a very, very important piece of technology of its day.
The replica shipwreck also supports Lake George tourism.
We cherish our heritage and our history, and this is a giant step, particularly along our beautiful walkway. It'll bring a whole new meaning to the history, what lies below. It's a marvelous way of showing people about what our history was in a very unique way.
Early in the 1995 dive season, Bateaux Below's Bob Benway and Joseph W. Zarzinski were diving in the lake when they discovered a Jules Verne-like underwater vessel that had been constructed to photograph the sunken bateau of 1758.
We were conducting a dive was part of a reconnaissance effort that was involved in a shipwreck inventory at the lake. And we were down in deep water, it was pretty dark.
As we were swimming along toward the end of our dive, we noticed an object that was sticking up off the bottom.
It was a strange-looking thing. That thing was a submarine. It had a conning tower. It had multiple component parts. It was kind of rusty, but you could actually make out that it was yellow. So we had found one of the great mysteries in the lake. We had found the missing baby whale from 1960.
The submarine, built by local entrepreneurs Art Jones, Jim Parrott, and Jerry Root, was a product of the times.
In 1960, one of the biggest events in ocean exploration took place in the Marianas Trench in the Pacific. That was a descent to a little over 35,000 feet in depth, which just fascinated the world.
Stephen C. Ressler is a former marine scientist and aquanaut that explored the waters of Long Island Sound in the early 1980s in SUNY Sub, an underwater research vehicle constructed at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He reflects on the state of underwater exploration during the 1960s.
Most funding, whether government or private, was being spent for outer space exploration. Very little was being spent, if you compared the two, for inner space exploration. But most of the advances were being made at the time with the innovative machines by individuals based on earlier designs, going as far back as Da Vinci himself, and trying these machines out.
In 1960, the summer of 1960, a 14 to 15 foot long yellow submarine called the Baby Whale was put on Lake George. It was there to photograph the sunken fleet of 1758.
It's amazing how similar the Lake George sub and SUNY sub are in that they were designed and constructed approximately 2 decades apart from each other. The designers and builders of SUNY sub, who were senior engineering design students, had no idea that there was a Lake George sub. But I think the designs were both a result of materials that were available to people at the time and some very basic principles based on trial and error.
What happened that night in August of 1960, the evening the Lake George submarine disappeared, stolen from its dock on the lake?
It seems that there may have been a little bit of revenge in the reason that the submarine was put down. Someone was mad at somebody else. They went there late at night, cut its lines, towed it out to deep water, broke the porthole, and the vessel went down very, very fast.
It was a great effort to try to find it. Divers were brought up to look for it. Airplanes flew ahead trying to spot a yellow dot in the lake that could be the baby whale. And it was simply forgotten after that.
Following the 1995 discovery of the baby whale, Bateaux Below's leadership notified government authorities. The team then completed a non-invasive mapping of the underwater vehicle. Ship modeler John Farrell used that data and developed plans for the sub. Farrell made a preliminary mock-up and then fashioned a scale model.
The Lake George sub, known as Baby Whale, or AKA Yellow Submarine, seemed to be fabricated from oil tanks, 275-gallon oil tanks welded together. And that was the main body of the sub. And then the flotation on either side was provided by what appeared to be water tanks, 2 on each side in the upper part of the vessel. The ballast were 2 water tanks supposedly filled with concrete, giving an approximate mass of 2,000 pounds. And shrouding in the bow and the stern of the submarine was provided by 55-gallon drums which had been cut in half. And the conning tower was half of an upright 55-gallon drum.
Soon, the Lake George submarine will be old enough to be considered eligible for the National Register of Historic Places.
We'd be interested in taking a look at the history of the Lake George submarine when it does become 50 years old in 2010. The Lake George submarine is interesting from a technological point of view. It was during a period when small submersibles were being experimented with, and this may have significance in the technology of ocean exploration and underwater exploration.
One of the least understood and little appreciated underwater sites at Lake George that is associated with the sunken fleet of 1758 is a colonial waterfront structure.
The military dock was built by the British in the autumn of 1758 to basically provide access to the larger ships that were now on the lake.
Often known as the military dock, pier, or wharf, this was one of several wharves the British erected at the south end of the lake during the French and Indian War.
Colonial Dock is a very important touchstone of the military history of the south end of Lake George. It's in close proximity to recognized historic sites such as Fort William Henry, Fort George, the camps that were built during the French and Indian War. This was the place where the boats met the water, where ships were built, where ships were docked, where the larger sloops and schooners were probably provisioned, where ordnance was loaded onto boats.
On September 16, 1758, shipwright William Swett wrote,
"Our men are now building a wharf."
On October 20th, Swett recorded,
"We launched our Radeau and finished her. Also, our sloop will haul into the new wharf."
The British were not able to return to Fort Caroline later in 1758 as planned. Thus, following a systematic sinking of their fleet, the British and provincial troops left the lake to winter in Fort Edward, Albany, or their homes. In June 1759, the British came back to Lake George, led by General Geoffrey Amherst. Amherst's soldiers raised the sloop Earl of Halifax and brought it into the wharf built the previous year. The general's shipwrights and carpenters also constructed the Radeau Invincible. It was the replacement for the land tortoise Radeau, a strange seven-sided floating gun battery which had been deliberately sunk on October 22, 1758, and was never recovered. Finally, on July 21, 1759, Amherst's 11,000-man army departed from the head of the lake in about 800 warships. The British landed at the north end of Lake George and occupied the French fortresses in the Champlain Valley. So then, what happened to the dock that launched Amherst's fleet of 1759?
The military dock was built by the British in the autumn of 1758, and it was used during the French and Indian War. 20 or so years later, it was used again in the Revolutionary War. After that, I'm sure it was starting to show its age, but eventually the effects of the ice, the weather, and probably people using the good source of raw materials, it was pretty much abandoned.
In 1819 and 1821, Yale professor Benjamin Silliman toured Fort George and wrote,
"At this place, although principally covered by the water, are the ruins of an old military quay or pier, formerly extending a good way into the lake, and affording important facilities to the numerous expeditions that have sailed upon Lake George."
Several 19th and 20th century maps show the old wharf. In the summer of 1937, a beach lifeguard and local constable swam down to examine the sunken colonial pier. The Lake George Mirror newspaper reported they measured some of the ancient piles in the water and found them in a good state of preservation. A nearby sign read, "Here Abercrombie's army in 1758 and Amherst's in 1759 embarked on their expedition against Ticonderoga." During the summer of 1950, a 23-pound cannonball was discovered in 6 to 7 feet of water during construction near Million Dollar Beach. Laborers also unearthed timbers from the colonial wharf. Sadly, a nearby 18th century pier was destroyed. In 1954, during construction to the west of the military dock, laborers used dynamite to remove an old pier, one that predated the late 19th century built Delaware and Hudson Railroad dock. 4 decades later, in 1992, the Lake George Historical Association and Bateaux Below erected a blue and yellow marker to replace the 1937 signage near the military dock. It was not until the year 2000, however, that Bateaux Below began a research project to study the old military dock. Following non-disturbance photography and videography of the submerged wharf, the group secured a permit from the state of New York to study the old wharf. In 2002, a 9-person team conducted 34 days of minimal impact archaeology to map the site. Follow-up reconnaissance dives were made in 2003 and 2004. After initial remote sensing fieldwork and underwater video and photography documentation, the team began mapping the site.
One of the first things the research team did on the colonial dock was to establish a baseline. Shortly after that, we set up a series of datum points to help us obtain measurements to help us locate unique parts of this dock.
92 logs were located, measured, and their locations recorded.
Now, the Colonial Wharf is a very interesting site to dive. It's in relatively shallow water. It's not an intimidating dive, and you can spend a lot of time looking at small details there. What we found is at the bottom of the wharf were very large logs that had been notched out log cabin fashion to create a crib work.
Most of the sunken timbers appeared to be pine from the forest that once crowded the area.
After the measurements were obtained from the site, I took those dimensions and input them into an AutoCAD program, and by taking distances, angles, other dimensions, we're able to create a site map.
The major section of the underwater structure is made up of 2 rows of logs. The deeper row has 37 logs, with their center lines oriented perpendicular to shore. These timbers rest on a king log, a structural foundation that runs parallel to the shoreline. The king log is nearly 64.5 feet long. Several feet from this row of logs and closer to shore is an irregular row of logs also oriented perpendicular to the beach. To the southeast of dock proper lies a scatter of rocks and 10 logs, possibly displaced by human intrusion or from seasonal ice damage.
We found a lot of ballast stone that had been contained within that crib work. Grapefruit, melon-sized rocks, easy for individuals to carry to the site and dump in.
Other rocks at the site were angular-shaped limestone.
The riprap used to fill the cribbing came from Fort George Park, and on an archaeological dig in Fort George Park, one of the crew uncovered a rock which had a hand-drilled hole in it, and on the wharf site you can find some of these rocks with hand-drilled holes in them being used as a riprap to stabilize the wharf itself.
The archaeology team discovered 2 rocks, angular-shaped rocks, with holes in them. These rocks had actually been mined from this quarry. And that was an exciting find for us because it tied the dock site into the nearby Fort George quarry.
Scientists from RPI's Darren Freshwater Institute collaborated with Bateaux Below to complete a flora and fauna inventory of the submerged wharf.
To the west of the Colonial Dock is an interesting site. It's a marine railway, a railway that was built by the Delaware and Hudson Company in 1910. From 1910 to 1950, this marine railway was used to launch boats, wooden boats, and in 1950 the marine track was abandoned. It was torn up when they built the beach road.
In 2002, divers discovered 2 short pieces of rail near the submerged dock, most likely deposited there during the marine railway's 4 decades of use. The metal rail may have been used to anchor navigation buoys that marked the deep end of the submerged pier. Vince Capone of Enviroscan Incorporated, a Pennsylvania-based firm, conducted ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, fieldwork at the wharf. First, the GPR crew surveyed the sandy shore adjacent to the underwater site. They discovered a cluster of GPR anomalies at depths of 4 to 9 feet. Was this a feature associated with the Colonial Wharf? The following day, the team worked from a research vessel and recorded GPR anomalies below the lake bottom along the span of sand between the submerged dock and the shoreline. This confirmed that dock structure is buried beneath the sand between the visible section of the wharf and the shoreline.
The site plan that we originally created primarily consisted of locating all the logs onto the site. However, there's a lot more than logs on the site. There were many rocks that we couldn't individually map. So what we did is we actually took a photomosaic of the entire site, and then after we had assembled the photomosaic, we were able to overlay it onto the site map and then recreate where the rocks were using the computer program.
Following the weeks of fieldwork, the task of data analysis began. One technique was to compare the computer-aided drawings with historic maps of the pier. A 1759 map of nearby Fort George showed the Colonial Wharf. Using the scale on the map, the researchers determined the length and width of the structure. The 1759 dock dimensions were then overlaid onto the CAD-generated map. This showed some spatial discrepancies.
Archaeological record and historical record were somewhat different. The historical record showed a pier, rectangular in shape. The archaeological record shows something that may have been T-shaped, or what we're actually seeing is the wastage from the demise of this pier. As it fell apart and so forth, it gave the impression of being T-shaped.
The archaeological investigators hypothesized that the military wharf underwent one or more periods of alteration during its use from 1758 to the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, and through the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. Occupying armies also undoubtedly practiced a scorched earth policy.
There had been an attempt to destroy this dock. The larger members weren't disarticulated, they were still in position.
Military forces reoccupying the head of the lake would have had to repair the pier, possibly adding or deleting sections. Nevertheless, construction details about the wharf can be deciphered. Archaeologists believe the waterfront structure was of solid crib design. Multiple timber cells were constructed with timber flooring that then were filled with rocks that sank the bulkhead, giving it strength. The top was probably finished off with logs, dressed with dirt and gravel or saw-cut planks.
There's still an awful lot that can be learned from this military dock, but without a doubt, it's the best example of an 18th century military dock that exists in the northeastern part of the United States.
In 2003, anchor damage was discovered at the nearby Delaware and Hudson Company Marine Track. The archaeology group has proposed to state authorities to establish a no-anchor zone for the area. This would help protect both the Colonial Wharf and the early 20th century marine track. While historic preservation is a major goal of Bateaux Below, another objective is devising innovative programs so that the public will support the scientific study of these 18th century historical treasures. The underwater archaeology team has partnered with Dr. Samuel Bowser, a cell biologist from Albany, New York, in an art-science initiative. Using a groundbreaking approach developed by Bowser and New Zealand artist Claire Bainan, the scientists and Bateaux Below have collected minute single-celled organisms known as testate amoebae, found in the lake sediment adjacent to the sunken bateau and old military dock.
The initiative itself deals with taking the archaeological drawings and miniaturizing that, and then using it as a topology upon which we can introduce Lake George microorganisms and see how they respond to those new topologies. I took those drawings and assembled them in patterns and used them as the template on quartz and silicon surfaces. And then we're going to challenge those surfaces with the testate amoebae. We're going to generate some really spectacular views of these testate amoebae interacting with an interesting substrate.
Using a sophisticated electron microscope, scientists studied the responses of the tiny testate amoebae crawling over the nano-sized images. Like laboratory experiments that once studied a rat's behavior in a maze, this research is of scientific value to cell biologists like Dr. Bowser. There is an important byproduct, too. Albany, New York artist Eleanor Mossop spent weeks in a lab using an electron microscope to analyze the science and archaeology-generated images. After interpreting these, she created dazzling artwork that explores the micro-world that inhabits the sunken fleet of 1758. This art-science initiative is proving to be an invaluable tool to link the public to the scientific research, especially the investigation of Lake George's hidden shipwrecks. Lake George's sunken Bateaux of 1758, the 1960 Baby Whale submarine, and the 1758-built military wharf provide researchers with unique insight into military life during the French and Indian War. Today, cultural resource managers are developing strategies to safeguard this noteworthy sunken heritage.
When we talk about preserving and protecting the lake, it's important for us to recognize that it's not only the water quality that is necessary to protect, but it's also the historical significance of the area, because the two go hand in hand.
1758 was the last year during the French and Indian War that Britain suffered battlefield setbacks. The following year, 1759, began a series of British triumphs that culminated in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. The British won the war not just because of the power of their muskets. They were victorious in large part, too, because of their bateaux and waterfront structures like the Lake George military dock. These provided the logistical means to move troops and supplies to secure the strategic inland waterway corridors of the Northeast. Ultimately, the unconventional strategy at Lake George in 1758 of deliberately sinking and thus saving much of the fleet to fight another day was instrumental to the British success during the French and Indian War.
Every time we take a measurement, it's a photo. Every time we analyze an artifact, it's opening up a photo album. Every time that we analyze our data, a window opens to the past, and it can tell us so much about Lake George and the shipwrecks that are found there. These wooden bones tell us about how people lived in the 18th century, and they enrich our lives as people today.